Stuart and Anne-Marie and Declan for inviting me to speak to you today. And I should say, Giagwich, I think is your welcome. What we're going to talk about is surgical trials and give you a bit of a sort of whistle-stop tour through some of the aspects of surgical evaluation and hopefully whet your appetite a little bit. And it's all about balance, and I'm going to use this sort of theme throughout, talking about the balance of various aspects of surgical evaluation. That's where we get this high wire from. And you'll see the flags up in the top corner. I hail from the Isle of Man. I'm a Manxman, born there. I've got an Australian passport, don't ask about that. I live in Wales, but I have a sister who lives in Dundrum in Dublin. And so I like to consider myself with strong Irish connections as well. There are my disclosures. There's nothing which affects this at all. And just a quick outline for you to see where we're going to go. I'm just going to introduce a few concepts and talk about why surgery is difficult to evaluate. I've got a penchant for the research question. I really like that sort of side of things, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. We're going to talk about the best design and introduce the concept of ideal, talk a little bit about comparators and controls, one slide on outcome measurement, move towards trial conduct, a couple of things on that, PPI, pathway, preferences and equipoise, and then perhaps some of the more challenging parts is the interpretation and implementation. We'll spend a bit of time on that and where we're going to go into the future. So we'll just step through it and take questions at the panel at the end. And then what I'm going to do as well, Jane's going to talk to you later on this afternoon or later on this morning about a specific trial. And I'll just highlight topics and areas of interest, and Jane will cover that with a good example as we go forward. But it's about surgery. But I want to make it clear that, first of all, I'm not an orthopaedic surgeon. My background is actually in rehabilitation, but I've done a lot of musculoskeletal stuff. The surgery is the focus of this because that's what we're talking about. But it can be translated to any complex intervention. So rehabilitation, physio, psychology. There's a whole group of different disciplines which may benefit from this complex intervention type approach. Now, why is it high wire? Why is it a balancing act? Well, we've got to do a few things. We've got to promote the inquiry without threat. People sometimes don't like torches or light shining into their world, so we have to be careful with that. And that's always been a balance, particularly with long-standing disciplines and long-standing practices. And theoretically, and when we're as trialists, and again, Jane will vouch for this, we like to do the perfect design, what's on paper, but often enough that has to be compromised a bit, and we have to have some achievable side to it to get the achievable study. So there's a balance there. There is innovation, and we don't want to stifle that, but we also have to consider the past and historical aspects and some sensitivities around things. So there's balance to be had in that as well. And then trials have been around for a long time, particularly in the pharmacological world. There's a universal sort of way of doing it, but within the surgical trials world, we've also got some nuances, which I'll hopefully cover with you. And then lastly, there's this aspect of social. We like to do this research for the benefit of people in the NHS, and that's a very strong part of it. But you can't ignore sometimes a commercial input into this as well. And increasingly, we're acknowledging that and incorporating it in an appropriate way. So there's a lot of balance going on. What's the point of it? What's the point of this evaluation? Well, in any kind of study or research, and particularly trials, it's about uncertainty. And what we're doing in surgery is, and this is really important, confirming that anything that is done, be it existing procedures, but also new ones, that if they are supposed to provide benefit, that they do provide benefit. And we show that, which is really useful. It's a positive. Conversely, if there's things that are going on which may be ineffective or provide a little benefit, they probably shouldn't be done. It costs money and you may be disadvantaging patients. So we need to kind of evaluate those and make sure that they don't proliferate. And most importantly, stop them from becoming established as time goes on. So sometimes they get established and we have to take them off. And that's more of a problem than looking at it from the start, as you'll see as we go through. Why do we want to do that? Well, actually, back in 96, Richard Horton, who was the editor, he still is actually, of the Lancet, gave us a bit of a wake-up call in surgical research and said that it's like comic opera, when was quite disparaging about it, and that's acted as a catalyst, a good one for Derek Alderton and the likes of Dion Morton, I'll just show later, to try and up the game of surgical research, and we've managed to do that, I think, as you'll see. And RCT is a very important component of that, And as we're going through, grandfathering some things in, but also using RCTs to look at new introductions of procedures. Just as an example, and you'll see this throughout this talk, I'm going to use CSAW, which is actually a shoulder operation, an orthopedic shoulder operation, whereby an arthroscope is introduced. Patients have pain in the shoulder, subacromial pain, look on an X-ray or some imaging, there's a bone spur or some closure of that space, put an arthroscope in and an instrument and clear it out. Makes sense theoretically. It's a very low risk operation and done widely, but there was a 7-fold increase in that over a period of time. You can see that on the graph on the right hand side, which may be the right thing. It's great, but it was done without any real evidence or justification, and that led to a real change and a variety of practice throughout PCTs in the UK and England. This is, so you can see that the amount that this operation was done varied from very little to a great, and there's no real explanation for that. So what happens when that occurs is you start to look at reasoning and whether it should be evaluated in a little bit more detail. And that uncertainty is a really important part. And Jane will talk about this in Romeo as well. Oh, wrong way, sorry. I put this up really early on because once you start to probe and look and turn stones over, you'll find things that you might not like. And I think the surgical community and ourselves as a whole just have to acknowledge that right from the beginning. It's not always going to go your way. It's not always going to show exactly what you want it to show. So those who seek the truth do run the risk of finding it, and we have to be comfy with that. And I say that in every voyage that we set out on now with any chief investigator. So why are these complex interventions such as surgery difficult to evaluate? Well, mainly because they're skill-based. And again, you'll see these red highlights here, which Jane will sort of pick up in detail later on. But it's expertise dependent. It means that you've got to have the skill to do it in the first place and be taught well. It's experience dependent, how long you've been doing it. Everybody wants to have somebody who's been doing it for a long time, usually. There's this issue of consensus and standardization. You might not all agree on the best way of doing it, and then throw in aspects of personality and character as well. So it makes it really difficult and challenging from a standardization and control point of view for a trial. It's not like just giving a simple pill, off you go, it doesn't matter who gives it. It's linked to all sorts of different aspects. It also is difficult to identify the active agent or the active ingredient in surgery. It's multimodal. It's normally a process, and it's very difficult, and we'll talk about that, to identify what the actual part of the operation sometimes is providing the benefit. And to be able to evaluate it properly, particularly placebo trials, we need to be able to do that. And then lastly, the history of sort of self-evaluation in medicine, and particularly in surgery, and a slight, much better than it was, but an unwillingness perhaps to look in detail about practices has not helped sometimes in setting this up to be able to be a wide evaluation field, but that's changing rapidly and it's great. In terms of the conduct and the sort of methodology side of things, we'll step through it. You've got to pick the right design or comparator. It's not always easy. We've got to identify this critical therapeutic element more often than not. There's lots of ethical issues attached to it. I'm going to talk about equipoise and whether the preference of the surgeon, how this plays into trials, and patient preference as well, which is really strong. You've got a scale-electric track there to represent crossover. They never pan out as you want them to, trials. And looking at the results and deciding what they mean. Again, I'll give you an example from CSAW, but it can be quite challenging. And looking at it through different filters and different visions and different angles is really important, especially if we're going to change practice, which is the point of all of these studies. I don't believe in doing any study which is not going to have an influence, change, or support practice. No point in doing it at all. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. And this is a slide about the Royal College as a sort of initiative. And that's Dion Morton, a colorectal surgeon from Birmingham up in the right. And he and Derek Alderson, now taken over by Peter Hutchinson, was really instrumental in setting up a group of surgical trial centres which have been dedicated and had dedicated sets of apparatus within that CTU to look at surgery with all the nuances and all the issues surrounding it. And you can see both Jane and I's units are named in there, and it's growing all the time. It'll be really nice to see perhaps an Irish one well connected or part of that at some time, but it's been a great journey, and we've now got 5 chairs in surgical science, the number of patients recruited to surgical science. and to trials has increased exponentially. And just as an, we've got a whole raft of studies. That's our group on the right hand side, but every surgical trials unit will have a set of a number of trials which they're involved in different disciplines. And there's a really key part of that, which is about education and training. So again, just as examples, it can range from rhinitis studies, surgery versus a three-way trial for that, pediatric plastic surgery studies, to the recent one we're just about to report on, the rupture of anterior cruciate ligament. And that's a management style trial where we're looking at surgery or rehab. So lots of questions, lots of different disciplines and subdisciplines. If you're starting out on this journey, I would point you, and I think Jane would do the same, to the ideal framework, which is a really good starting point to think where your research might sit within this. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but effectively ideal is a framework which sort of positions your particular study. Is it just right at the start in terms of the procedure, first in human, looking at things, quality recording, no real hypothesis? Is it at a development stage and exploration where you're filling in those gaps before you go to something like a stage 3 study, which is the RCTs that we predominantly talk about, where you've got hypotheses and you have comparative groups. And then finally, the stage 4, where it's long-term follow-up, maybe cohort studies or safety studies with registries, for instance. But it's really useful to sort of look at that and decide where your study, if you're setting out, where it might fit. And there's some guidelines which will help you with that. And again, we've translated that to physio, we've done it to devices, and it's really quite broad. So go and have a look at the ideal side of things if you're just starting out in this. Now, I love the research question and getting the right research question, because everything hangs from it. It's so important. And I'll talk about whether there's real uncertainty or not in a second. But it needs to be clear. It needs to be really clear what you want to answer. And it's not straightforward. You tend to think it is. So the first thing that somebody comes into my office, I say, what is it that you really want to answer here? Is it effectiveness? Is it that the surgery, you want it to work? Is it the efficacy and understanding the mechanism of it and how it works? Is it for account? Do you need to account for anything like a placebo effect of surgery? Usually yes, maybe not, if you're looking at a different question. Or is it simply, is it the best treatment to offer when you're comparing a couple of different treatments? And you plug that into a PICO type format. So just in terms of this research question, is it real? I mean, I always like to do this. So you assume sometimes that the problem exists. It may not. So this is a study called TOPCAT, total or partial knee replacement. And what we were looking at here is which is the best knee replacement, a partial one or a total one for medial compartment arthritis. And the suggestion was that surgeons would vary and do what they wanted. And there was a real variance in what was going on, a bit like the CSAW variance that you saw from the national statistics. So we did a very simple study. We got a set of x-rays and clinical data, and we asked a group of different types of surgeons, different grades and representations, what they would do with that particular patient. And it was really interesting that we had a different choice in treatment in up to 59% of cases. So that showed the uncertainty. It showed that the research question was real and that we can go forward, plan a study, and answer the question appropriately. What about the comparison? So this is, again, sort of embedded within our PICO world. And it very much depends back on this question that you're setting. I like to think of it in 3 ways. So first of all, you might say, I'm just interested in the best treatment out of a couple, 2, 3, whatever. If you do MAMS type designs now, you can actually do several different treatments on one go. But let's compare 2 treatments, for example. It makes it relatively easy. You've got treatment for patients in both arms. You can look at surgery v surgery, a bit like TOPCAT, or you can go surgery versus conservative management, a bit more complicated, but at least patients having treatment. It's the easiest type of trial to do, in my opinion. You move to does it work and look at sort of core effectiveness and efficacy. It puts in some problems because you're often saying, I'm not going to do something compared with doing something. And that brings in ethics, it brings in preference, and it brings in equipoise. If you go a stage further to the right-hand side, and you want to understand how it works, as well as looking at the effectiveness, I'll give you an example of that in a second. We're talking about surgical versus placebo arm groups, which both Jane and I have an interest in. And you know, it brings in another whole raft of issues, blinding, interpretation, as well as ethics and equipoise. So just be mindful where you want to go. And I'm sure Jane will talk about that in her talk later on. So going back to CSAW, subacromial decompression for shoulder pain. I've told you about the operation. Here's the little piece of tissue, be it bone or tissue, which is going to be removed. It's fine. You remove it and see whether it works. So we set out to see whether this was correct or not. 313 patients. We looked at 51 patients, 32 centres, looking at straightforward pain function 1 year down the line. We perhaps could have looked at it for a bit longer. The design side of it is interesting because what we've effectively got is a double control group for this. We've got our group C here, which is the control group, the natural history. It's an overall control, and you can compare that to an overall surgery group if you want to. What you probably do is actually compare it against the proper treatment, just so that you don't get a dilution effect, and that's what we did. But overall, the question here is the surgery effective? We're not bothered how it is effective or not. We're doing nothing, but we're actually comparing it against some form of surgery. Throw in a placebo control group here, and it will give you information about the mechanism. And the useful side of that is that it takes account of this quite substantial placebo effect, which occurs with most healthcare interventions, but particularly with surgery. And so you end up with, one, the surgical effectiveness, and secondly, the mechanism, and then accounting for the placebo effect. Sounds easy, but it's not, because what you have to do is to decide what are you going to take out from the operation to make it placebo. And you can go from, oh, I'm going to have to just, we've got a 10 o'clock. Just bear with me a second, it will go off. Oh, okay, I did warn Tom that. Keeps us on our toes, I suppose. So just thinking about the placebo intervention, what part of it is the thing that's doing the doing, is the active ingredient? What part of it do we need to take away to show that that works? And that seems simple in the first place. People use sham, where it's a complete pretend, but we don't like that word anymore because patients don't like it and it sounds wrong. We've moved to talking about levels of fidelity. And a recent workshop that we had, well, not recent now, but in the last few years, defined the levels of fidelity for the procedure, from high fidelity, where it's nearly the complete attribute, down to a low fidelity, where there's very few attributes to the index procedure, and it's closer towards not doing anything at all. It's a total pretend surgery. And then you've got a no surgery control, which we've already talked about. If you want an analogy, it's a bit like having the full car, a car without an engine, a car without wheels and an engine, or even a car which looks like a car but isn't a car. Or likewise, an apple with various bites out of it to an item which actually is looking like an apple, but it actually isn't. And that helps us describe and represent and reproduce the experiment and the content of the experiment for evaluating the surgery. So overall, I'm going to leave placebo-controlled designs now at the minute, but I always like to show this slide. It's a placebo-controlled design is it's like these things. It's a beautiful thing, but sometimes quite difficult to control if you want to control. George Best, a Mustang, people say this 911, I've never driven one, depending on who I'm talking to, whether it's the Scottish nation or yourselves, the Irish nation, beautiful things, but sometimes quite difficult to stabilize. So take them on at your risk. Outcomes. I'm not going to talk about outcomes a great deal because you could have a whole talk on it, but you do need to be mindful of it. And what I would say is that one of the most important aspects is making sure that you understand the psychometrics of it, the measurement properties of the tool. So what is the minimally important clinical difference? What is the thing that you're trying to shoot for? Will the instrument give you that? And I would also say, if you want to move towards simple outcome measures, I've got a tendency these days to not get too complicated and ask simple questions like you would do in clinic. Are you better? Would you have the treatment again? It's quite blunt, but it's actually the question that you would normally ask patients and what they understand, rather than complex intervention measures, which sometimes we went down. But they're only as credible, the trials are only as credible as their endpoints, so think about them carefully. There's always a balance in that as well. Okay, PPI, patient public involvement. You may have a different term for it in Ireland. And that has progressed a lot, but it's very key at the moment, particularly for grant applications and just the conduct and running of the study. Back in TopCat, when we did that years ago, started off, it's got 10-year data coming through shortly, but seems to be going on forever. 2009, we got a patient involved, said, do you fancy just coming and listening to a few meetings? Lip service, terrible, really the almost the poorest part of PPI, but it wasn't developed at that stage. Much more recent trial, SNAP trial, co-applicant, forum for patients, had input into the outcome measure, went over iterations, part of the grant application. completely engaged with the whole process, which is the way it should be. And you know, you could think it might be a bit tedious and boring, but you need to think about it early. And one of the best examples of PPI I've ever had was working for the European Space Agency, where we had to chat to astronauts, and it can be quite exciting as well to talk about the people who you're going to influence with the research. They were very cramped in their spaceship, out of interest, on their trip to Mars. They didn't want to be so cramped, and it was all about back pain and stuff. Now, understanding the pathway is also really important. And, you know, it's not just, again, I put the red and the blue pill up, here you go, have this, have that. The surgical process, and those of you who are listening will know this, that a patient coming in to have surgery can go all sorts of directions. There's lots of trip hazards, pivot points, decision points along the way. And we like to sort of map that out. This is an early diagram from ACL SNAP from Dr. Loretta Davis, who is the portfolio manager here now. But this is what we tend to do with our studies. We look at every decision angle point in this so that we understand what's going to happen. And when you map and template a trial to it, you've got understanding of it. The worst case is you don't understand this and try and set a trial up in an environment which you have no knowledge of. The trial just won't work. And when you step through all of these things, you realize that there's certain areas which need much more emphasis than others. But just be mindful of that. It's very different to just handing out different tablets. This is a bit of fun, but I always think it's good to put up. There's nuances for surgical trials, and as in all trials, you'll find all sorts of personalities in there. We'll have investigators who actually control the whole thing, and you can't get a word in edgeways and change things, or you'll have a completely absent chief investigator. I work with lots of statisticians, and they're fabulous, but be mindful that sometimes they become quite clinical in time, but they're great. There's a never from ourselves. Sometimes people argue that we're never there and available for things. And then the undercosted health economist is interesting in itself. I'm not too sure I've seen too many of those. It's just a bit of fun. All people, the team is important, and every one of those actually have to be working together in synergy and understand their role for the trial to work. Treatment preference and bias, a really critical aspect, and from both the patient point of view and the surgical side or the clinician side, patients will have opinions, and surgeons and clinicians will have opinions on what is right. It's not necessarily a problem as long as you account for it and understand it. And you can do that in various ways. I mean, just in terms of how it affects things, just as an example here, if you were doing a study on non-operative versus operative treatment, there is an immediate imbalance in how it's perceived. So you've got this sort of lower risk, lower complexity, low tech, tend to sort of have a feeling of low efficacy for the patient, and the placebo effect might be much lower. Stick them in an operating theatre, high tech, complexity, the whole thing, high risk for some reason, and it's semi-understandable, but this equates to a feeling and a perception of higher efficacy. So your placebo effect might be much greater, but it's really not comparing like for like. So you have to sort of get back to balance. You have to flatten that out a little bit. And you're working against things like resentful demoralization as its worst case. So you need to work hard at making sure that both arms, or three arms if they are equally appealing. And that can be quite a lot of work. If it's impossible to reconcile, you can do an expertise-based design. So ordinarily, single surgeon, happy to do both surgeon procedures. Again, this is top cat, both knee replacements, a uni or a total, they can do both operations. That's great, it's controlled within surgeon. If they're not, and you've got two surgeons who really want to do different things, you can put them as a pair and in equipoise as a unit. So the patient will move in this case, and depending on what they're randomized to, the procedure will be carried out by the surgeon who is expert or chooses to do that. It can be a good thing. It can magnify the effect if you think it's important, but it does require a bit of organization and harmony. If these two people fall out, and it has happened, then you end up losing your randomization unit and you lose patients all round. But it can be done. Right, last few areas now. Interpretation, pretty key, obviously. You've done all the hard work and you get the data in. I always think it's really worthwhile to look at the raw data in any form to start with, because it kind of gives you the feel of it. This is the raw data from CSAW, our 3 groups. And I think I would probably dispute anybody who told me, just looking at the patterns of these, that these are just changes in scores over time. So mainly getting better, but a few going down. Whether there's any real change in the pattern between those three groups. You can see perhaps the green one, the no treatment, is slightly lower than the other, but the patterns are very similar. And on your eyes, like a histogram, it just gives you an immediate feel for what you're trying to explore. So you don't go off and start searching for things which aren't necessarily there. When we do put it into and package it up and put it into sort of summative graphs like this one here, so this is the published graph for CSAW, you can see these are the three groups: the arthroscopy only in red, the decompression group, the actual surgery in blue, and the no treatment in green. No difference at all between the arthroscopy and the decompression. So that's actually the placebo arm, if you like, the non-intervention arm, non-intervention surgical arm, and the actual proper operation all the way along the line, just no statistical difference. There was a difference between the surgical groups and no treatment, but it didn't reach the minimally important clinical difference. And you could argue that, okay, yeah, they've all gone up, it's a bit better, but is it sufficient? And we decided as a group that it wasn't sufficient to be able to say that surgery was manifestly better than not having surgery, because these patients don't move. If it had been a flat line, I think you could have argued slightly differently. But they all improved and not much difference between them all. You can see the values there on the left-hand side. So those are the sorts of discussions you need as a group, not one person doing it, with input from various people to decide what the study will tell you. So the take-home message of this, there's no difference between it. The surgery does not provide the benefit by which the mechanism we thought, and the benefit was not as substantial as we'd hoped for. So you can send that off to a third party, blinded. I've done that before with studies, and it works well. So you're not interpreting it yourself, but you get to a conclusion. So with CSAW, it's difficult to justify a procedure now without a mechanistic basis, with no clinically important benefit. So where does that leave us? You go, well, do you know what? We probably shouldn't be doing this, but it's not for me to say. The whole purpose of surgical trials for me is not to make those dictations. It's actually to provide information for clinicians to make their choice. And so for us, study done, clinicians have the choice to do it. I thought that was it, job done. Changes then. So what we have then is this response spectrum. And this has been fascinating for me because I just thought that was taken as read. This is back to those who seek the truth run the risk of finding it. People divide into two groups and a few in the middle, which we'll talk about. There's the non-believers and objectors. And people go, no, it doesn't fit my model, it doesn't fit whatever, or just don't believe it, or whatever, for whatever reason. Sometimes fiscal, which is complicated, but they just say, no, I'm not taking this on board. And sometimes it can be so extreme, and with CSAW, that those emblems along the bottom here, this is the German orthopedic group, all got together, I'm not sure who orchestrated it, but wrote a letter to us to say that we completely disbelieve CSAW and it has no part in German healthcare, mainly because it didn't suit the model of how they deliver healthcare. There was whole hospitals dependent upon it. There was whole rafts of innovation and commercial activity and insurance systems which were based upon doing that operation. So it just really didn't suit their needs, but it was uncomfortable for a long time. The other end of the spectrum, and it's just as bad, is that the commissioners go, well, we've got a great piece of evidence, let's take it off the shelf. Nobody does this anymore. And I think that is wrong too. So the point of doing these studies is to allow objective, sensible clinicians to make a decision. And I call them, in the Roman world, they'd be called moderates, or optimates and populares, and they sort of wedded to the beliefs of Cicero. We like to think that that middle ground is where we should probably sit. Not this end of the spectrum and not the other end of the spectrum. Always helps if there's a second study, and we were lucky in this case, well, not lucky, but I knew what was going on, that the finished study completed and showed exactly the same thing. Quite difficult to then object against it and say that this is not really a characteristic or a feature. Are we going to go about improving things into the future? And this is where you come in as a group, and I think it's really important. Both Jane and I are really embrace this. So more than aware of the pressures on surgeons. It's all about empowerment of clinicians and surgeons for me, involving innovation, making sure that the commissioners and side of things don't do things which are inappropriate, providing time for research, and there's a lot of professional creep and things going on. So we need to just look after this body a little bit if we're going to get good studies come forward and from the surgical body. And I feel really strongly about that. So we have to acknowledge it. And Jane and I run a course with Jonathan Cook as well, which is called BOSTIC. And any of you are welcome to join this, the Bristol and Oxford Surgical Trials course, which we've developed out of the course in Bristol over the years, where we try and educate surgeons to start thinking critically and accept that there's some ways that we can improve evaluation of surgical procedures, and that we don't always know, and that, you know, evaluation is part of it. Is the RCT always the best way? Maybe not. It's a good at the moment, and that's why we teach it, but our eyes are open to other methods, and sometimes the RCT, because it's a law of averages, we're taking averages all the time, is not the best way forward. What's the future look like? Well, it's going to be RCTs, it's going to be cohort data combining to give us the information. It's going to be, and this is an example of a study which I'm involved in at the moment, robotic surgery. It's going to be about rolling things out within the healthcare framework and system. So we're doing a study whereby we're looking at the value and the delivery of robotic surgery, but instead of saying nothing can happen before we do this, which you might do with drugs, we're saying, let's let it go a bit, but we need to evaluate well and rigorously as it is rolled out. And then that way you don't stifle the innovation, and it's in a very efficient system. So I think we'll see more of those sorts of studies. What we don't want is to see this sort of uncontrollable weight and inertia where you can't stop it. And before you've got something in place, which nobody's really looked at properly, it should look like it's good. And that's the idea. It's meant to be positive. But if it's not good, a bit like mesh, a bit like some of the implants that we've had, then we can address it straight away. So just to finish off, summary message very briefly. For me, collaboration is the key to this, and that's the, you know, talking to groups like this, which is great, really important. Embrace that collaboration, connect up, build the knowledge slowly. When you find things out, no knee-jerk reaction, think about them really carefully and decide on the interpretation. That balance of things all the time, for me, is very important, and it's important to keep a perspective and have some fun at work. But if you're involved in surgical procedures and things, for me, that little description on the bottom there, put a bit of color into your world, perhaps with some research, I think is a useful way to go. Lots and lots of people to thank. I can't thank them all, but they know who they are. And whenever I do a talk like this is not just me, this is years of influence and people have been involved.